Hello everyone. Welcome to the Lightning Ball channel. If you haven't yet subscribed to my channel, please do so and activate the notification bell. Your support fuels my continued efforts. In our previous episode, we witnessed how Guy resolved to eliminate Twilight at all costs, leading to the true beginning of his battle with Velzard. In this episode, we will shift our focus to Sarion, returning to the events of episode 113, where the crisis of the Divine Tree was temporarily averted after the Berserk Milim was successfully led toward Heaven Tower by Rimuru. However, with Rimuru's sudden disappearance, the situation took a sharp turn for the worse. Sarion would once again face an impending catastrophe. In this episode, we will see Elmesia, Leon, and Sylvia in utter despair after witnessing Milim's overwhelming power, the conversation between an enraged Zalario and the deranged Feldway, and the crucial arrival of Chloe at a decisive moment. So, let's get started. With the Divine Tree momentarily safe, the exhausted Benimaru returned to the underground labyrinth. Kigali and Tia, leaving only a brief remark about tracking Jahil, disappeared soon after. Though both had received ultimate enchantments from Seal, neither stood a chance against Jahil. Staying put might have been the wiser choice. However, for Kigali, her hatred for Jahil was immeasurable. He had nearly wiped out everyone she held dear. Furthermore, Kigali had learned that Laplace was Sylvia's husband and Elmesia's father. Having been erased by Jahil while trying to save Kigali, Laplace's sacrifice weighed heavily on Kigali's heart, leaving her with conflicted emotions. Understanding this, Elmesia and the others refrained from saying anything, silently watching them leave. Those who remained behind were already exhausted. Their taut nerves finally granted a moment of respite. Zalario and his Phantom's army, having incarnated, could at last experience the temptations of fine food. After finishing his hot soup, Zalario turned to Leon, inquiring about his next course of action. Leon, savoring his post-meal tea with his usual elegance, responded with a calm smile, asking whether Zalario was looking for a duel. As the man whom Guy had once described as utterly dull, Zalario entirely failed to pick up on Leon's playful tone, seriously stating that in preparation for the upcoming turmoil, it would be unwise to waste energy in unnecessary battles. Leon nodded in agreement. He had a certain appreciation for Zalario's straightforward, no-nonsense warrior nature. But disaster struck before they could continue their conversation. Luminous doomsday proclamation was projected near the Divine Tree. The invasion of Evarage and the Cryptid's army was imminent, and worse still, Rimuru had disappeared. To make matters even more dire, the Berserk Milim was once again barreling toward the Divine Tree. The group immediately began discussing their next course of action. As if things weren't bad enough, communications with Tempest were inexplicably disrupted, likely due to some unforeseen emergency. Elmesia and Sylvia both felt the weight of the crisis pressing down on them. They had barely begun to recover, and yet the situation had taken a drastic turn for the worse. Even for those who stood at the pinnacle of the world, this was an immense psychological burden. Now, they faced a crucial decision: should they abandon the Divine Tree and rush to aid Luminous, or should they use what little strength remained to make a desperate stand and defend the tree to the death? Everyone knew the truth: against the rampaging destroyer Milim, they had no chance of victory. In fact, they might not even have the ability to buy time. While efforts to evacuate civilians were being carried out as swiftly as possible, many still expressed their unwavering resolve to share the tree's fate. It seemed that the longer-lived a race was, the more likely they were to accept their end alongside the Divine Tree. Leon was the first to break the heavy silence, declaring that he would take on Milim and suggesting that Elmesia continue fulfilling her duties as Emperor by focusing on protecting and evacuating the people. However, Elmesia firmly rejected the idea. At this moment, every bit of fighting power mattered, especially with Feldway's forces closing in. Zalario, on the other hand, stated that he had a personal score to settle with Feldway and would handle Feldway himself. Sylvia also insisted that she would fight against their formidable foes, urging Elmesia to focus on guiding the people to safety. Yet before Sylvia could finish her sentence, Elmesia interrupted. Her resolve to join the battle was absolute, and the imperial aura she exuded was unmatched. Even her mother, Sylvia, could not compare. Even though their defeat was inevitable, Leon, Zalario, Sylvia, and Elmesia all resolved to fight until their last breath, choosing to uphold their dignity and battle to the very end. The good news was that storm dragon Veldora was on his way to Sarion. As long as they could hold out until his arrival, there was a sliver of hope for survival. However, due to the urgency of the situation, there was hardly anything resembling a proper battle plan. Zalario's army assisted in evacuating Sarion's citizens, while Zalario himself focused entirely on preparing for his imminent battle with Feldway. The noble families of Sarion also did whatever they could, though their efforts seemed futile. Against Milim, even someone like Leon would likely be killed in a single blow. Leon, Sylvia, and Elmesia decided to take turns harassing Milim, ensuring that she would have no opening to unleash Drago Nova. This meant that Zalario would have to handle Feldway alone. A chill ran down Zalario's spine at the thought, and Leon quickly noticed his concern. The current Feldway had deployed his true, complete form. Zalario had no way of gauging how powerful he truly was. Ever since the ancient era, after being sealed away, Feldway had never once used the body Veldanavasama had bestowed upon him. The sheer, overwhelming presence that Feldway exuded was something even someone as prideful as Zalario could not ignore. After all, his energy was on par with, or perhaps even greater than, that of a true dragon. Even the slightest miscalculation would mean certain death for Zalario. Yet the pressure on Leon's group was even greater. Both Leon and Zalario had already confirmed that even their most powerful finishing techniques were completely ineffective against Milim. The attacks were effortlessly blocked by the invisible barrier, a mere byproduct of Milim's Drago Nova, highlighting the vast chasm in their power levels. Forcing himself to remain calm, Leon stated that their goal was not to win but merely to divert Milim's attention, engaging her in a high-speed battle of evasion in order to buy time for reinforcements. Sylvia chuckled, joking that Leon truly was her disciple. His ability to flee was just as impressive as hers. Leon, unimpressed, retorted that this was hardly the time for such an unreliable comment. Even in the face of imminent death, Sylvia and Elmesia, mother and daughter, didn't forget to tease Leon. Yet their light-hearted banter was far from meaningless. It was a strategy to ward off the looming despair, even if only for a brief moment. And to some extent, it worked. Each of them was now in their optimal mental state for battle. At that moment, Milim was hurtling towards Sarion at an astonishing speed, dozens of times faster than the speed of sound. The instant they confirmed her approach, the battle had begun. As planned, Leon, Elmesia, and Sylvia spread out in a triangular formation, surrounding Milim. As disciples of the same master, their coordination was seamless. Even more remarkable was the similarity between their ultimate skills: Leon's Lord of Brilliance, Sylvia's Lord of Thunderstorm, and Elmesia's Lord of Heavenly Wind, all specialized in enhancing speed. The three of them used their skills to fix points in space, allowing them to maneuver freely through their chosen paths. Though hastily formed, their teamwork was near perfect. Leon took the initiative, assuming the most dangerous role as the primary attacker, and unleashed his ultimate technique, Melt Breaker. Its core principle was identical to Hinata's Melt Slash, with the key difference being that Leon controlled spiritrons through his authority, making his version significantly more stable and sustainable. When pushed to its limits, the technique could be amplified into 100 Breaker. Not knowing whether it would work on Milim, Leon decided to test it. But what he saw next left him utterly shocked. His attack landed squarely on Milim. For an instant, he even thought he had inflicted serious damage. However, Milim had not even attempted to defend against it. She simply didn't care. The mythical, ultimate weapon, Flame Pillar, wreathed in the radiance of disintegration, a blade capable of cutting down even demon lords, had only managed to leave the slightest scratch on Milim's regenerative dragon scales. The actual damage was non-existent. In her stampede state, Milim paid it no mind and continued flying toward the divine tree as if nothing had happened. Sylvia was the next to strike, but her attack was just as meaningless. Elmesia shouted at them, as if to rally the two who were now dejected. declaring that she would enhance their speed using airflow manipulation and urging them not to give up. If one attack didn't work, they would simply try again. Thus, Leon and Sylvia launched attack after attack while Elmesia provided continuous support, engaging in a relentless, wave-like assault against Milim. Finally, Milim showed a reaction. In the next instant, a powerful lateral wind blasted Leon and Sylvia away, and before they could recover, a massive energy blast nearly struck them, instead detonating in the distance with an earth-shattering explosion. Milim, clearly irritated by their repeated harassment, had casually fired off a magic bullet. Had it landed, even a single careless mistake would have resulted in their immediate deaths. Fortunately, Elmesia had reacted in time, blowing them away from the blast zone. Yes, even a stray attack from Milim was lethal. The perspective shifted to Zalario, who now stood in midair, facing Feldway directly. Feldway was the first to speak, questioning why Zalario had betrayed him. The usually gentle Zalario, however, was furious at Feldway's arrogance, stating that it was Feldway who had first tried to manipulate him, yet now he had the audacity to question his so-called betrayal. Feldway, however, saw no issue with this, casually explaining that he had merely used his authority to strengthen their bond so that his orders could be conveyed more smoothly. Zalario found Feldway's twisted logic incomprehensible, while Feldway, in turn, was completely unable to empathize with Zalario's anger, stating that since they were friends, having a unified will shouldn't be a problem. But what Feldway called a unified will was nothing more than complete subjugation to his own commands. In his eyes, individuality was unnecessary, and any dissent was simply unacceptable. It was only then that Zalario realized Feldway had no concept of respecting others at all. At this point, meaningful conversation was impossible, let alone mutual understanding. This was the only conclusion Zalario could draw. And yet a part of him still held on to a sliver of hope. He had failed to notice his friend's change before, and perhaps Feldway had simply been crushed by loneliness for so long that it had twisted him beyond recognition. As long as Feldway was still willing to talk, Zalario for sure should continue the conversation. Zalario examined Feldway's true form, feeling an overwhelming pressure that could crush him with ease. The power gap between them was unfathomable. A chill ran down his spine. Feldway now felt almost as if Veldanava-sama himself had been resurrected. His appearance and form were identical to the Veldanava-sama Zalario remembered from ages past, save for minor differences such as hair color. Zalario knew he had no chance of winning. From the perspective of buying time, persuasion seemed far safer and more reliable than engaging in battle. Struggling to find a breakthrough, he finally spoke, stating that Veldanava-sama would never have wished for the destruction of the world. But Feldway countered with a question: why was Zalario so sure of that? According to Feldway, Veldanava-sama had embraced everything, allowing all beings in this diverse world to evolve freely, yet the only result had been endless conflict. The intense competition for survival would eventually drive the world to its end. Zalario retorted that the existence of demon lords itself was proof that Veldanava-sama wanted to prevent destructive internal conflict among the races by giving them a common enemy to rally against, thereby maintaining balance. Feldway, however, gave him a pitying look and dismissed his argument outright, claiming that he had come to understand a fundamental truth about this world: all living beings granted life were not evolving freely, but rather, they had been assigned a predetermined fate. Feldway's words immediately put Zalario on high alert. The distinction between being allowed to evolve and being assigned a fate carried a deep implication. It spoke of obligation. Regardless, this was Feldway's personal interpretation of divine will, a truth shaped by his own bias as an outsider looking in. Zalario had never expected that Feldway, the supposed overseer, would turn out to be no different from the ignorant masses, trapped within his own echo chamber, believing only what he wished to believe while completely disregarding the parts that truly mattered. This was a distortion of truth itself. The words of a god should be transmitted exactly as they were, without alteration. Interpretation was natural and expected, but when someone with great influence misinterpreted divine will and acted upon it, countless followers would be led to ruin. The fact that even Feldway, the very being who stood as Veldonava-sama's right hand, had fallen into such blindness made Zalario lament how difficult it was to guide humanity. Still, Zalario believed that even Veldonava-sama was not omniscient or omnipotent. He, too, could make mistakes. And if their creator could err, then it was only natural that he and Feldway, as his creations, would also be flawed. But what Feldway said next left Zalario utterly speechless. Feldway declared that whether it was de Gruel, Twilight Valentine, or Insect Lord Zelenus, all of them had been assigned a fate greater than their predecessors, the destiny of deicide, the task of surpassing and slaying their own creator. As for himself and Zalario, as the 7 angels of origin, they were born perfect beings, which was why they had never understood this concept. But now, Feldway admitted that he was beginning to grasp it. His conclusion was that those beings strove to surpass Veldonava-sama precisely because they sought to form a real, tangible connection with him. And he, Feldway, didn't even have that. There was a deep sorrow in Feldway's eyes as he spoke. Zalario, unable to comprehend his twisted logic, could only continue listening, tense and wary. If nothing else, he had to stall for time. But negotiating with a friend who had fallen so far into madness was taking a greater toll on his spirit than any physical battle ever could. Feldway went on, stating that since he had no such destiny connecting him to Veldonava-sama, he would create the conditions to fulfill Veldonava-sama's true wish, bringing about the final destination of all evolution, the world's destruction. Zalario panicked. This logic was absurd beyond belief. Desperately forcing himself to remain calm, he pressed on, questioning what would happen if Veldonava-sama had never actually intended to destroy the world. If that were the case, Feldway would be going against divine will. Without direct orders, as subordinates, they should never act arbitrarily, much less assume their creator's intentions. But Feldway shattered Zalario's remaining patience by pushing his argument even further. He claimed that if a foolish subordinate went astray, then the true leader would surely intervene to correct them. In other words, Veldonava-sama would personally appear to stop him. Feldway's fury erupted, pouring out in an uncontrollable flood of emotion. He raged against the foolish mortals who had killed Veldonava-sama, against those who had allowed it to happen. But at the core of his anger, what he was truly furious about was Veldonava-sama's absence. That was the rawest, deepest truth of Feldway's emotions. His hatred was not for the world, but for being abandoned by Veldonava-sama. Zalario looked at Feldway's face, eerily similar to Veldonava-sama, and found it laughable. Feldway had been without a doubt the one Veldonava-sama trusted the most, the one he relied upon the most, which was why he had been given the solemn duty of overseeing Evarage. His very body was proof of that, a form created personally by Veldonava-sama, a body remarkably similar to his creator's. Veldonava had long, flowing black hair imbued with the radiance of the stars, symbolizing the vastness of the universe, while Feldway's hair was silver, a symbol of the brightest light. And yet, despite receiving such favor, Feldway still dared to complain, even going so far as to seek the world's destruction. As a warrior, Zalario found his weakness unbearable, using others as mere pawns while forcing them to sympathize with his own suffering. Feeling abandoned was no excuse for manipulating others. From that perspective alone, Zalario felt nothing but disgust for Feldway's overwhelming selfishness. Zalario drew his blade and assumed a combat stance. His sword was a mythical-level weapon, sharp enough to cut through the Insector Generals and their alienium-reinforced exoskeletons with a single strike, a divine artifact, without question. He was well aware that his overall strength was inferior to Feldway's, but when it came to technique, he was confident in his superiority. He planned to strike Feldway hard enough to bring him back to his senses. But Feldway merely gazed at him with cold indifference. Even in his maddened state, Feldway's intellect remained razor-sharp. He had already seen through Zalario's attempt to buy time. But he didn't mind. His absolute scorn made that clear. Zalario, unshaken, had no illusions. Convincing Feldway was mission impossible. If he was going to suffer through his deranged ramblings, he would rather fight. The two took their stances, and Feldway summoned his Genesis-class weapon, Sword Arc. Suppressing his sorrow, Zalario launched his attack against the friend he once knew. At the same time, the trio battling Milim had already been pushed to their absolute limits. They couldn't afford a single moment of carelessness, constantly responding with razor-thin precision, as if walking a tightrope over an abyss. They had to keep provoking Milim, never allowing her the chance to assume the stance for Drago Nova. Leon and Sylvia took turns engaging Milim, while Elmesia intervened as needed, providing support. The three of them had abandoned defense entirely. No matter how strong their barriers were, if they were hit even once, it would be the end. Three of the world's strongest beings could only rely on sheer speed and evasive tactics to disrupt Milim, a strategy that was undeniably pathetic yet the only option they had. Milim was simply too powerful. All they could hope for was to delay her, just a little longer, even a few seconds might make a difference. But their limits arrived suddenly and without warning. Elmesia, originally the primary support, was locked onto by Milim. Despite being in a berserk state, Milim's combat instincts were nothing short of extraordinary. She saw through the trio's coordination and realized that Elmesia was the key to their strategy. Ignoring Leon and Sylvia entirely, she fixated on Elmesia, relentlessly pursuing her. At that moment, all their tactics crumbled. Everything had relied on splitting Milim's attention to ensure their safety, but Milim had no intention of playing along. With Elmesia targeted, her only option was to flee, nothing else. Misfortune compounded. Their entire plan had hinged on the assumption that, for an instant, their maximum speed exceeded Milim's. However, Milim's reaction time was increasing at an alarming rate, seemingly without limit. Elmesia was the slowest among them. Now that she had been targeted, it was only a matter of time before she was caught. Leon and Sylvia grew increasingly frantic, but they were powerless. No matter how many times they struck Milim, their attacks had no more effect than a gentle scratch. As for Elmesia, no matter how desperately she ran, she couldn't shake off Milim. Even when she tried unpredictable, erratic movements to throw Milim off, the berserk dragon girl was able to track her precisely through magic perception. And this was just Milim running on pure instinct, in a mindless rampage. Her combat judgment was still terrifyingly precise. Elmesia was beginning to understand just how powerful Rimuru truly was. He had gone toe-to-toe with an opponent like this. That was simply unfathomable. In this moment, Elmesia's mind flooded with memories of Rimuru, from the conquest of the Jura Great Forest to the founding of the Monster Federation. From the countless brilliant inventions to recruiting Primordial Black, and eventually gathering not just one, but 4 primordial demons into his ranks, she had been utterly speechless at the time. She had once asked Rimuru what he would do if Diablo ever went berserk, and his calm reply was that he would stop Diablo himself. She had not taken those words seriously back then, she had only admired Rimuru's composure. But now, she finally understood, he had meant every word. All of Rimuru's achievements came rushing into her mind in a split second: the formation of the 3 drunken sages, the reconstruction of the Western nation's governance, his efforts to create a world where no one would be left behind. A dream that once seemed impossible had become reality. More than that, Rimuru was a kind, honest friend. No matter how hopeless the situation, as long as Rimuru was there was always a sliver of hope. He was like the ace in a deck of cards, just having him on your side was reassuring. But now, Elmesia was worried about Rimuru's fate. More than luminous doomsday proclamation, it was Rimuru's disappearance that truly troubled her. If she were to die like this, she would be too ashamed to face Rimuru in the afterlife. But she couldn't even imagine Rimuru being truly cornered. He always found a way to turn things around. Elmesia was wondering whether this was just the life flashing before her eyes phenomenon that happened before death. At the same time, Sylvia and Leon's shouts echoed through the battlefield. The desperate chase around the divine tree was about to reach its tragic conclusion, along with Elmesia's life. She wanted to fight back, but she was truly powerless. Leon groaned in frustration, as if willing himself beyond his limits to rescue her. But no matter how skilled he was, it was impossible. Even if he caught up, the only outcome would be him dying alongside her. This was Milim Nava, the daughter of the creator god, the legendary being at the center of countless myths. When she was with Rimuru, she had seemed like nothing more than a cute little girl. But now, she was nothing less than an apocalyptic calamity. The high-energy attack closing in on Elmesia was lethal beyond measure. Even the slightest contact would shatter her body completely. Even as one of the world's top warriors, at this moment, she could do nothing but await the inevitable. Elmesia closed her eyes. At this moment, her greatest worry was that Leon would spend the rest of his life in regret over her death. She wanted to do something for him in her final moments, but she had no chance. Elmesia shut her eyes. But then, she heard something. A small, childlike dragon's cry. Milim was approaching at speeds dozens of times faster than sound, so logically, the sound couldn't have reached Elmesia first. It had to be an auditory hallucination before death. But the expected impact never came. Elmesia sensed something different and opened her eyes. And she was stunned. Floating before her was a small dragon. And even more incredibly, upon hearing its cry, Milim actually stopped for a split second. That brief pause was enough to save Elmesia. Holding the small dragon in midair was a young girl. Her hair was an unusual color, a rare blend of black and silver, an unmistakably striking beauty. In the distance, Leon seemed to be shouting something, but to Elmesia, none of that mattered. Her gaze was entirely captured by this mysterious girl, and for a moment, she was left speechless. Yes, this girl was one of the children Rimuru had taken care of. Then, the girl handed the tiny dragon to Elmesia before turning toward Milim, taking a stance that signaled she would face her alone. Elmesia felt a sense of relief, a continuation of hope. In the blink of an eye, the girl's figure vanished, replaced by the graceful form of a woman. Holding the mythical class rapier, Moon Mistress, clad in holy armaments, she was the strongest hero. She was Chloe. Chloe unfurled her barrier, neutralizing Milim's attack. Because of her intervention, Elmesia was saved. And then, the ultimate battle between Milim and Chloe was about to begin. Alright, that's all for this video. In essence, this episode serves primarily as a setup for the upcoming developments. Technically, it could have been much shorter, but since we have enough time, I felt it was better to go through all the details thoroughly. First, let's talk about Chloe. One crucial thing to note is that Chloe and Cronoa have completely fused into one entity, meaning that Manus Cronoa no longer exists. This is Chloe's peak state after acquiring Lord of Justice and evolving into a god-level ultimate skill holder. Second, Feldway's descent into madness. By this point, his destructive personality has become extremely pronounced, showing clear signs of dangerous obsession. In TenSura, the final boss is bound to be a figure driven by a destructive persona. Whether that will ultimately be Feldway or Evarage remains uncertain for now. Third, Elmesia. Though she is Sylvia's daughter, her temperament is significantly calmer and more composed than her mother's. Sylvia still carries traces of Twilight's obsession with unraveling the world's truths, whereas Elmesia has fully stepped into her role as the true ruler of Sarion. In our next episode, Chloe will display overwhelming strength and exceptional battle command skills. However, even she will struggle against the sheer power of Milim. Just when the situation reaches a critical point, Veldora will enter the battle. The next episode will be just as thrilling. If you enjoyed this video, please like, comment, and subscribe. Your support is greatly appreciated. See you in the next one.